Hi, my name is Caitlin Farthing. I'm an art historian and conservator/restorer. My specialty when it comes to art history is twofold. One, I love applying fine art theory to things that are not traditionally considered fine art, like comic books and video game and cartoons. I'm also very, very, very interested in the ways that we use visual language to communicate things to each other past what can be said. So all of the things in video games and animation that you cannot just have a character exposition dump on top of the audience. And to my left is the singular most amazing, smartest, beautiful, wonderful person in the world. I'm not biased, my husband.
She can't be talking about me. There's no way. Anyway, my name is Alex. I teach at Westchester University, where I'm at the Wells School of Music. So I teach music theory, counterpoint, music history, things like that. But mostly my interest, I did my dissertation on jazz in the 1920s, 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But lately my interests have kind of branched out a little bit. I am interested in like music and media, music literacy, how we interpret semiotics through music and things like that. You know, the more you know, the less you understand. It's great. That's the definition of a PhD, by the way. So let's go ahead and forge ahead. As I said, this is the outline for today's lecture, or whatever this is going to be. If for some reason you feel like at any point you've lost interest, we do not object if you leave. Obviously we would love for you to stay for the entire thing, but if you have better places to be, totally understandable. Okay, so let's dive in. So cyberpunk is a tricky and a very interesting concept because it's usually used as kind of a universal catch-all term for anything that is near future, technological, sophisticated, yet simple.
If it's got neon and criticizes the government, it's cyberpunk.
Yeah, but it's really much more complex than all that. So the roots of cyberpunk go all the way back to like the 1940s and 50s, and you could conceivably even argue that it has roots in retrofuturism, which itself is an idea that kind of supposes that it's the way the past looked at the future. And in a way, cyberpunk is kind of a way that we in the present look at the near future, but in a very dystopian, very pessimistic way. We're not looking at the future through these bright, rosy colored goggles. We're looking at it by taking the current state of affairs and taking it to its logical conclusions. Like everything sucks and it's gonna continue sucking until the suck becomes like our entire existence.
Disney World is not turning Tomorrowland into a cyberpunk world, sadly.
Right. Yeah, so the definition, of course, is that cyber, of course, implies technological advancement. It implies a lot of integration of humanity with machinery, and punk is simply the aesthetic suffix for that. So just like steampunk, just like diesel punk, just like a variety of other these ideas, we're simply taking this notion of cyber and we're applying it to an aesthetic principle. But punk in this regard stands for more than that. It is also the idea of rebellion. It is the idea of rejecting authority, because punks have historically always been about rejecting authority. The punk movement in the 1980s has started really kind of taking off as an anti-authoritarian, anti-Thatcherian movement. And I think it is from there that a lot of this terminology is derived. So what are the primary principles of cyberpunk? Well, if I have a poster of Cyberpunk 2077 up here. If you've played the game, or if you've played the board game, or if you've played Shadowrun, or literally consumed any variety of cyberpunk media up to including Blade Runner, what have you, you will notice some pretty common trends. Technology is paramount. So in the novel Android's Dream of Electric Sheep, that Philip K. Dick wrote, upon which Blade Runner is based on, Deckard and his wife have this thing called the mood organ, right? Which is essentially a thing that integrates with your body to create an emotional state for the day. And so even your emotional state is inherently tied to this idea of machines governing over it. So you're no longer responsible for your own body, but at the same time, you are also responsible for machinery that is responsible for your body. Transcendentalism and transhumanism is the second idea that cyberpunk very forcefully injects into a lot of its media. So transcendentalism is this idea of transcending something, whether it's your norms as like, the gender binary, or it's your physical existence, or if it's something else. But it's this idea of blurring the boundaries between things. Transhumanism is probably the most simple way of framing that, and that is transhumanism takes this notion of integrating yourself with machines and becoming something else. And this is something you see a lot of in Ghost in the Shell. This is something you see in Cyberpunk 2077, the game. This is something that you see a lot of in Final Fantasy VII. A lot of these ideas are very dominant in Cyberpunk.
The way that gets described is what is truly human?
Right.
That's the question you've probably all heard said aloud in a cyberpunk movie.
Yeah, the entire premise of the movie Blade Runner is essentially surrounding that question. And then Blade Runner 2049 takes that even further by basically rejecting that entire premise and saying, like, no, the integration of humanity and technology is not that. It's not what we're after. Anti-corporatism plays a very important part in this. And this actually ties into xenophobia and Japanophobia to a very major extent. And there's a historical precedent for this. A lot of cyberpunk media, as we know it, has started developing in the 1980s. So this is where cyberpunk enters the mainstream. Blade Runner, Shadowrun, the cyberpunk role-playing game. And this is roughly coinciding with the time when Japan was just rebounding off of its economic collapse and is now starting to become this massive powerhouse of technology, of manufacturing.
This is when Japan was finally starting to get over their international reputation from World War II.
Yeah.
They were finally starting to push past, you're the bad guys, we don't want to talk to you, ever. And they're finally starting to get the world to care about their media, which a lot of people in the States did not like. How many of you were in high school in vaguely the 80s and got to see a go beat up a Japanese car rally?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, good. There we go.
We did
One
not
person
like
at least.
that Japan was like getting a voice on the world stage in the slightest. And so there was a lot of East Asian phobic media at the time, and Cyberpunk was not spared from it.
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of an interesting thing, is that in a lot of cyberpunk media, the Japanese are portrayed as the foreign demons, right? They are, like if you think about Johnny Mnemonic, the movie with Keanu Reeves, Cyberpunk 2077, obviously the Arasaka Corporation, RoboCop 3 even, I mean, which technically doesn't really fall under cyberpunk unless you really squint hard and look at it from a certain angle. But even that has like the evil Japanese Yakuza ninja robot. I am not making this up, I promise.
There's a reason all of the robots have a very East Asian inspired face in a lot of these movies.
Yeah, so, and this is largely because at the time, in the early 1980s, when a lot of this media was coming out, the Japanese economic powerhouse was such that we were actively concerned that Japan was going to just economically start dominating the East, or first the East and then the rest of the world, and then we are essentially going to fall prey to Japanese corporations. Granted, like, Huawei kind of did Japan's job for them, to some extent or another, but, so like really we were kind of concerned for the right reasons, but maybe about the wrong corporations. But in any case, this anti-corporatism is very closely connected to Japanophobia and xenophobia, which is still very much prevalent in today's cyberpunk.
Yeah. How many of you saw the controversy about Stray? The game about the cute cyberpunk game about the kitty, and everyone's like, it's racist. If you look really closely at the aesthetics of, particularly of what the robots are wearing and the way the like lower class levels of the city are designed, they're very East Asian.
Yeah, they're wearing coolie hats and things like that. Yeah.
That may not have been an intentional slight on the developers' side, but there's a reason that Cyberpunk has such heavy East Asian influences in the aesthetic of it.
Yeah, but that matters, right? It counts. Okay, great. And then obviously, like the last thing we have to talk about, this is the idea of survival of the underdogs. Because in hyper-capitalism, there is really no way to climb to the top. There is a game called Cloudpunk, which is absolutely brilliant. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend it. But there's a line in there, like trying to make it in the city of Novalis is a little bit like trying to paint on water. I'll let that sink in. I mean, I think it's a brilliant line, being that if you have like a stream of water and you try to put paint in it, the paint is just going to get diluted and washed away. So no matter how beautiful a painting you make in the moment, it's still going to get completely removed and forgotten after a while.
Have you ever noticed that no protagonists in Cyberpunk are rich? You're not going to get Bridgerton or Downton Abbey out of Cyberpunk.
Right.
And like no one has even tried to do that because it's just so antithetical.
Yes, please.
Person.
The core line
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. And I think that that is a great way to summarize all of that.
For anyone who didn't hear that, he was
Yeah.
saying that the Cyberpunk 2020 tabletop game, the core line is
High-tech,
high-tech,
low-life.
low life.
Yeah, and the idea is that absolutely every aspect of society is corporatized and sold to you. So they don't care what exactly it is you consume. They don't care if you are straight, if you're gay, if you're non-binary, if you're trans.
If you got money, you got money.
Yeah, exactly. What kind of fetishes you have, what kind of like food you consume, whatever it is you do you, boo. So long as you're paying for it, it's fine. So then that leads us to the core thesis of today's talk, which is what about cyberpunk in Japanese media? Because obviously I already kind of stated that cyberpunk is different, right? There's no monolithic cyberpunk. Like to some extent, if you really squint hard, again, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, which is based upon the Soviet novel Roadside Picnic, is kind of cyberpunk, right? I mean, it's eldritch horror and it's kind of combined with a lot of different things, but like squint real hard and it's cyberpunk. Again, you look at the movie that it's based on and the game that's based on the movie that's based on the novel, Stalker, and again, you're looking at the same exact thing. It's the melding of technology and humanity to create some sort of a new being. So how is Japanese cyberpunk different? Well, the core difference is in the discrepancy between the tropes. So, for starters, religion is kind of omnipresent in cyberpunk. Generally speaking, religion is something that is cast as an alternative to technology to some extent. Those of you who have played Cyberpunk 2077 might remember that little tidbit where you go to Jackie's memorial service and then everybody kind of gives this really beautiful eulogy and then V goes up and gives this really beautiful eulogy and the whole thing is kind of taken place in a bar that has been kind of remodeled as a Buddhist shrine. So there's a religious and a spiritual component to a lot of this. So in many ways, the religion in Cyberpunk 2077 is cast as the opposition of technology, right? Jackie was killed by this technology.
Yeah. Did anyone watch Altered Carbon?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you remember very early on when they talk about there's a certain religion that will not let them jump bodies? And they are shown as like complete Luddites, will not interact with technology at all. So it's very, very set in cyberpunk that religion and technology are complete opposites. Even if in the real world they aren't exactly.
But in Japan, that's not necessarily the case, right? Spirituality and religion don't have to oppose technology. They are not diametrically poised. In fact, they are frequently seen as kind of substitutes of one another. It's not uncommon to see decrepit churches and Buddhist shrines decorating a lot of East Asian cyberpunk elements. I'm sure all of you have seen that art that has like a robot or like a cyborg praying at a Buddhist shrine or something, or like, you know, Bushido samurai with like cyborg arms and things like that. I mean, heck, Sekiro is a perfect example of this. But religion does not have to be opposed diametrically by technology. They are, in fact, kind of complementary things. They are the flip side of the same coin. Transhumanism as a fusion of machine and man is not necessarily a good thing. So we see cybernetic enhancements. Like, for instance, you know, this is something that Western cyberpunk has embraced to some extent lately with games like Deus Ex and then Deus Ex Human Revolution and Mankind Divided, where they're like, oh yeah, these things are bad for you, or like these things are bad for you, but then they give you these really bizarre superpowers and you're like, hell yeah, like I can jump from rooftops and I can shoot like, you know, claymore mines out of my armpits and whatever, and it's great, like it's fantastic, like, oh, I didn't ask for this. Well, okay, cool, but you're still using it, so it's fine. But in Japan, that's kind of the opposite, right? So becoming more than human, becoming a new life form is not necessarily a good thing, and as we're going to find out sometimes is a portent to extremely dark, sometimes kind of eschatonic and apocalyptic end results. Being a corporate drone or a gig worker is not necessarily demeaning. We're going to see this in Cowboy Bebop, but because Japanese culture is so heavily tied to this idea of the salaryman, somebody who essentially dedicates his life to the company and exists as part of a company, it's like the drone in the hive, it's not seen as demeaning. It's seen as just a part of existence. There's an ecosystem that surrounds us, and doing gigs is not considered to be a shameful thing. It's actually considered just, you have to do what you do to get by. Technology can alienate, but it can also bring us closer together. The Japanese idea of the otaku, right? this notion of the shut-in, of somebody who only communicates to the outside world through the computers and media message boards and instant chat, is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, I mean, yeah, they're kind of to be shamed, but there is a certain virtue in committing yourself to that degree of immersion into cyberspace. And then finally, nature and technology are not necessarily diametrically opposed. For what we're going to see in Final Fantasy VII, for instance, nature is complementary to technology, and it's something that frequently is able to coexist with technology. It's just something that when the balance is disrupted, that's when things start getting very hairy. So this idea of the balancing act between things and equivalence of equal parts is something that permeates pretty much every aspect of Japanese cyberpunk from my standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. The only thing I would add is that Japan is obviously a very Shinto region of the world. The religion of Shinto has this idea that every single thing has a spirit, and therefore every single thing you interact with has to be respected. So when you take that into account when you're looking at Japanese cyberpunk with their respect to the way they treat technology and treat it less as this terrible, awful thing that's going to destroy us all, and more as something that is almost living and breathing and growing with humanity, it gets really interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let's talk about some of our examples. So the first one that I want to talk about is Final Fantasy VII. This is the original one, not the remake. I have feelings about the remake. I'm not going to voice them right now. If you're interested about my feelings on the remake, shoot me a private message later. We're going to put up our socials up here, so I will absolutely talk your ear off for hours and hours and hours about why it's not good. Anyway, so let's talk about what Final Fantasy VII represents. Given that it was created in 1997, just about the time when Al Gore was starting to ring the alarm bells about El Nino and global warming and an inconvenient truth, and everybody was just kind of like, oh, haha, whatever, Al Gore's a kooky man, right? He clearly needs to do a thing, but like, here we are, 25 years later, and oh no, the world is kind of going to hell in a handbasket, so who's laughing now? It's Al Gore. But the point is that even then, the developers of Final Fantasy VII kind of had an idea. Now, keep in mind that originally Final Fantasy VII, like back when it was created for this, was being developed for the Super Famicom, was a completely different game. It was taking place in like a 1999 New York City, and your entire job was basically finding these Mako reactors and blowing them up, and instead of the Shinra Corporation, there was like a private eye that was hunting you called Bob, and it was weird. But they expanded it into this thing, and they created something truly, I think, truly monumental in many ways. I mean, because there's a reason why Final Fantasy VII is the one that gets the remake, right? It's not
There's a
8
reason
or
that's the
10
one
or
everyone
whatever.
knows and everyone loves, and that's the one that got a movie.
Yeah, but the symbolism of the Final Fantasy VII is incredibly long-reaching, and I think that it tells us a lot about cyberpunk in Japan in just a very, very few symbols. So the first thing that we're going to encounter in this game is the color green. So the city of Midgar is colored green, which, by the way, let's talk about the symbolism of Midgar. Midgar is Midgard in Norse mythology is where men live, right? That is the contrast to Asgard, which is where gods live. So by definition, it is the low ground. It is the land of the commoners. It is the land of the people. And it is dying. The planet itself is basically having its juices wrung out of it by the evil corporation Shinra. And there's absolutely like no lampshading there, right? They're not trying to hide the fact that Shinra are just a bunch of cruel, evil bastards who are just in it for the profit. Like Rufus Shinra basically says that if I can twist the knife a little bit harder, I'm going to, if it nets me an extra $1, which is just a supremely cyberpunk, like bad guy mustache twirling philosophy to have. But at the same time, there are moments of absolute pristine beauty, and most of them are contrasted against the technological nightmares that Shinra throws at you with like very natural things, and particularly Aerith. If you've ever wondered why Aerith is like the favorite character despite having like basically zero personality in the original game and, you know, maybe like a few dozen lines, she really doesn't do a whole lot until she gets killed by Sephiroth.
Spoilers.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. She dies. Oh no. So she really doesn't have a whole lot. It's her presentation, right? It's the way that she comes across. It's the way that she exists within this environment. She's so contrasted against the backdrop that it's impossible to not immediately focus on her. So this is the scene that I'm usually going to be referring to when I talk about the heart and soul of Final Fantasy VII. I'm not going to show the whole 12 minutes, but this is worth watching. So as this is going, I'm just going to talk about how the majority of Midgard is just completely bathed in this green light, and it's like this really unnatural shade of green. And then here we have Cloud waking up in the remains of an old church amidst this garden with this girl kind of just hovering angelically over him. And notice the music here is also kind of interesting.
It's not a coincidence that the first person who really cares about you in the game is also someone who's nurturing flowers.
Now, this isn't your first encounter with Aerith. You have kind of a very quick bump into her on the street, but you know, but before you actually talk to her, it's fine, whatever. Like, you just run into her, you knock her over, she drops her flowers, boo-hoo, big deal. It's just another citizen of Midgard. But it's here that, you know, she recognizes you, she remembers you, and she's like, oh, you're that kid that like ran into me on the street. It's fine, I'm fine. And then she pulls you up and basically is like, hey, do I need to like take care of you? So the presence of green here is actually kind of an important symbol because, again, up until this point, we've been experiencing Midgard in this green neon glow that looks absolutely noxious. It's like the whole city is like bathed in this green cloud of poison. And here we have sunshine and that same green, but a warmer green somehow, right?
Yeah, so how many of you are familiar with this dress and why it might be sitting here next to this? Ooh, yes, person in the green mask.
I forget the name of the material, but it's like, it was used in a bunch of clothing, it's highly flammable, where it's like it's beautiful but fragile.
Yeah, so the color green that exists like this, previous to when these styles started existing, this color green was not possible. It was not seen in the world. It does not exist in nature. It does not exist in flowers, in trees, in animals, in plants, in anything. And it was not until we started inventing chemical dyes that we got this color, which is called arsenic green. There is a reason that every bad, poison, evil thing is bright neon green. It's because that color never existed in nature. We see this bright yellow, almost orangey undertone green that looks sickly, and we see it as light.
You can
and
actually
it instantly
really tell the orange undertone right there, bottom right.
And it instantly tells us that this is not natural. This is fake. This is something that was created by technology.
Yes, please.
Yes.
Touching on that arsenic paint.
Yes.
Yes.
In England,
Yes.
we're saying, oh, you're not feeling well, you should take a vacation.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from the fact that when they would go on vacation, they would go away from their houses, often painted with lead or arsenic paint.
Yes. Yeah, so the point is that,
Breathe in and get sick from.
yeah, the idea of taking in the airs was because, oh, you just go out and experience nature, it'll be good for you. It's because you're no longer surrounded by your lead and arsenic paint
Right.
that is slowly killing you from the inside as you breathe it every day. So yeah, we have this inherent association through just generations and generations of only being exposed to this color through technology, that this color is sickly and unnatural. And there's a reason it's such a popular color for light in video gaming, cyberpunk, anything to do with technology. There's a reason that it became the default color for extraterrestrial light. It's because this is the only color we never see in nature. The only color that gets similar are those poison tree frogs. if you look them up, but if you see them in real life, they're more like leaf green. So what Final Fantasy VII is doing is a really, really interesting thing, because green is heavily associated with nature. Like, every druid player in Dungeons and Dragons you've ever met has like everything green that they can possibly own, but it's never this green, because this is the only shade of green that just does not exist in nature. And so when Final Fantasy juxtaposes this awful, sickly, not of nature green with beautiful leaf greens and floral greens and just gorgeous sunlight,
Yeah.
it becomes an interesting discussion about nature versus technology, and can they exist together?
Well, and keep in mind that this whole scene takes place in an old church, right? Remember that I mentioned that in Japan, religion and spirituality often coexist side by side with technology. The fact that Aerith tends to these flowers in an old decrepit church in the middle of the slums of Midgard, like basically one of the worst districts in this technological nightmare, is very telling, right? So it doesn't really, and I think she even has a monologue about this. I'm not gonna like inundate you with watching this entire scene, but the idea is that she basically says, like, flowers grow where they choose to grow. Like, they don't have, they don't get to choose. They just find a patch of ground and there they are. And so this idea of nature coexisting with technology is something that's at the core of Final Fantasy, and also is one of the representative ideas of Japanese cyberpunk.
Somehow coexisting, but also working against.
Yeah. So the other thing that's interesting about environmentalism in Japanese cyberpunk is this transcendental nature of it. So I might have mentioned that there is this notion of the space between. So like, you're the space between genders or identities, or you're the difference between technology and nature. So it's this like notion of the middle ground. And if we take a look at a lot of the player characters for Final Fantasy VII, you'll notice that there is kind of an interesting blend. So on the one hand, we have Cloud, who is an amnesiac, essentially like a genetic construct, right? Who is a product of Shinra. So he is about as corporate as you get, but he is rejecting some of those ideas in his design by using a traditional weapon, something that is associated with the samurai class, something that is very spiritually connected to the past of Japan, a sword, right? Same thing with Sephiroth. Sephiroth is kind of Cloud's dark half, in that when the creators of Final Fantasy Final Fantasy VII were conceptualizing this, they really wanted Cloud and Sephiroth to be diametrically opposed, like Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro. So the two swordsmen, who are kind of almost legendary in status in Japanese folklore, and so having them being diametrically opposed ties us in once again to this notion of spirituality and folklore and religion, but at the same time, they are still genetic constructs. They are products of Shinra. They're the intellectual property of a corporation. So we have this idea of, well, who's really responsible for the rivalry? Are they responsible for it? Is it a predestined mystical thing, or are we looking at something that was constructed technologically to poison one against the other? This idea of transhumanism is also something that is very common here. So we have Barrett Wallace, right? The character with the gun arm. And much like Adam Jensen, he didn't ask for this, but at the same time, he is not embracing his augmentation. He pretty much every single time that he talks about it, he's like, I hate this thing, and then you get to find out that he got it under extremely tragic circumstances. Sid is a scientist, right? His whole thing is that he works on rockets, but he's a former Shinra employee. So he is once again kind of connected to this idea of finding the cosmos, but he is rejected by the corporation that created him. So this sense of in-betweenness is very much there. Kate Sith is a great example of this. By the way, fun fact, we were gonna totally do a Kate Sith cosplay, and then it just never materialized because apparently it's really hard. But Kate Sith is a megaphone cat who's also a robot, who's also a Shinra product, who is run by one of the Turks. Okay, so let's press on. I just have a couple of slides here of the contrast between Midgard and Nibelheim. And so both of these are, again, kind of showcasing very similar ideas, so that we have Midgard on the left that has the green glow, and it's extremely technologically advanced. Meanwhile, on the right, we have a very kind of bucolic image of, I know, I'm trying to get through as fast as I can. We have this very bucolic image of Nibelheim that is basically an English village, except that it has like this horrifying reactor in it. So once again, we have this kind of melding of technology and science. Okay, great. Why don't we press on? Because I do feel like I need to move on to the next topic. So the next one is Ghost in the Shell that I want to talk about. Are you guys familiar with the concept of the ship of Theseus, this philosophical exercise? Okay. So for those of you who are not, it's the question of how many parts of the original thing do you need to remove in order for it to become a new thing? So like, let's say you have an axe, right? And the handle breaks. So you replace the handle. And then later down the road, the blade breaks. And so you have to replace the blade. Do you still have the same axe? Right? So that's kind of one of the things that Ghost in the Shell brings up for us, is this idea of what is becoming transhuman, and to what extent do we need to replace parts of ourselves and still retain our identity. So let's talk about this idea of reclaiming one's humanity in the face of eschaton. You look like you had something to say. No? Okay, good. So the plot of Ghost in the Shell basically revolves around this hacker, virus, entity, something called the Puppet Master. And they're trying to figure out what it is before it essentially wreaks havoc on their systems. Major Kusanagi ends up blending with this thing, and together they kind of come out as a new life form. So there's, again, this sense of in-betweenness as they kind of emerge out of this idea. But this doesn't just come on its own, right? We have about 90 minutes worth of movie before that communicates a lot of these ideas to us. And there is a brilliant moment in this film, which is when I think that this realization clicks into existence, when Kusanagi looks up at a window and notices that there's somebody in that window who looks exactly like her. So let's go ahead and watch this sequence here, and I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about what some of the interesting things are. There. Okay, so without inundating you guys again with pointless recordings of this show or this movie, which you can definitely and should watch on your own, this is a pivotal moment in this show. So in this film, where not only are you examining this world from a very low perspective, meaning that you're being put directly into this world, implying that you have a connection to this, meaning you have a place in this. There's a bunch of other really fascinating things about it. The first is that obviously this interaction between Kusanagi and her twin, who do not know each other, it implies this notion that physical appearances are ultimately kind of pointless, because those two things are not the same. They look the same, they may act the same, but Kusanagi is not whatever that thing is in the window, right? And the same thing is kind of also transposed onto a lot of these ideas of like fabricated memories. So one of the inciting incidents for this movie is a guy who has his memory overwritten, who is acting as a courier to drop off packages for a terrorist. And then when they capture him and bring him in, and they're like, hey, all your memories are false. He basically has a nervous breakdown. He's like, what do you mean? I live in a house with my wife. And they're like, no, dude, you live in a bachelor pad with like a box of ramen. And he's like, but here's a picture of me with my dog. And he's like, that's not your dog. And later on, the dog makes an appearance in this sequence. So this idea of a loss of identity through just commingling with other people like yourself is something that's very much prevalent in the heart of cyberpunk.
So when we're talking about cyberpunk, one of the things, does anyone remember what was kind of going on in Japan in like the late 70s, early 80s? Like, yeah. Guy with the ponytail who raised his hand first in the middle.
Please.
White mask. Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. Dude who stood up for a second. Oh, okay.
Please.
Oh, God, that's right. Wasn't that in, like, Norway, though?
Yeah, actually, that was, like, somewhere in Scandinavia.
So what we're talking about is sort of not only the bubble economy. So when economies get hard, we get a lot of messaging, like we're getting right now going into a recession, of everyone needs to work together. Mm-hmm. Everyone needs to forget what they want and just kind of suck it up and do what they can to help society through, right? So, and also, keep in mind, Japan was still at this time facing a lot of pressure from the world. A lot of, you guys were the bad guys, you guys did bad things, we don't want to interact with you, which leads to an incredibly isolationist economy. If no one else is going to deal with you, you got to deal with yourself. And so when people are making media, they're often talking about the things that they experienced in the past using the language of the current language aesthetic. Like, there's a reason that every Disney movie now, the bad guy is generational trauma and not like a random, vaguely Middle Eastern dude like a lot of movies we used to see. It's because the people who are making movies now are using the aesthetic language of now to talk about things that they dealt with. So when we're looking at cyberpunk, we have to keep in mind that these people are using the language of cyberpunk to talk about things that they dealt with as kids. And that incredibly isolationist economy, isolationist sort of society, and this idea that you just kind of have to suck it up and do what you need to do to help everybody else.
Yeah, and collectivism is really something that's very common in non-Western countries. I mean, and I don't just mean Japan and China, I also mean Russia and South Asia and a lot of these different places. There's simply a different culture that surrounds it, and as a result, we have a much closer, more connected community that surrounds a lot of these cities that are far more integrated than the ones in America. The one thing that I definitely want to touch on is this idea of the music kind of suffusing this entire thing. So this is actually kind of a little pet project of mine, is looking at music in media and what it tells us about it. So in this case, that extremely trance-like singing that sounds almost transcendentally religious is actually nothing more than a Bulgarian choir. So this might be kind of a mind blower for a couple of you guys, because we don't expect, why would there be Bulgarian chorus music in Japanese cyberpunk media? Okay, cool. Well, there's a few reasons. One, of course, is that it's a commentary on the globalism of the whole situation, right? Cyberpunk frequently refers to this idea of co-opting things without context and just inserting them into things for reasons that are somewhat inscrutable. But the other thing is that it's often used as a stand-in for the other, right? And if we're talking about this idea of Kusanagi feeling as somebody who's a person apart, we're looking at the music needing to highlight this. It needs to be ethereal, it needs to be sharp, it needs to be cutting, and it needs to sound weird. And
it needs to sound like something you're not used to.
Yeah, this is this notion of othering that I absolutely love in music, because it's the music literally telling you what the character is feeling in this moment. And this is also something that you hear in like Spirit Stallion of Cimarron. Brother Bear used it a lot. Witcher 3, weirdly enough. So like that Banana Tiger song, right? Okay, that's actually a cover of a Bulgarian a wedding song called Dazorovanya. So in most ways, like Bulgarian folk music just sounds weird and foreign and strange. And if you want to highlight this alienation and setting apart of a character from a community, you are probably going to end up using something like that, or something that's really, really sharp and weird and otherworldly. So speaking of transhumanism, mortality plays an important role in transhumanism, particularly because this notion of the abnegation of the self and the surrender of the body and the insignificance of the physical form is something that's really important. Let's take a look at this scene. draw your attention to this shot right here. So this is actually really interesting, and this is true for the majority of this movie. Kusanagi has these giant cesspool eyes, okay? So anybody want to like tackle why? Anybody have any thoughts? Yes, sir. Please. Sure, yeah, there's more of a symbolic context with it. Yes, please, black jacket.
Symbolically, the eyes are the mirrors into the soul.
Yes.
Therefore, she finds herself looking in her own eyes and wondering what's behind it.
Bingo. And by
A+.
extension,
You can get an A+ in this panel.
yeah, and by extension, we are also going to be drawn into them. The way that these eyes are drawn in the animation, we are forced to look into them. And we are forced to kind of contemplate the nature of humanity as a result. And this scene is particularly interesting. I mean, one of the things about the way Kusanagi is drawn is she doesn't blink, ever. Like, it's also something that you notice in Blade Runner. In Blade Runner, also, the replicants have these weird eyes with kind of like this orange tint in them. Never blink. It's so weird. Like, that's what makes them so strange looking. So this idea of mortality and inhumanity is also something that is very dominant in Japanese cyberpunk. So like, think about what happens after this scene, right? She climbs into the boat and Bato, whose name literally means boat in French, is basically like, I still don't understand this. Like, why would you want to go diving with your body that weighs as much as a dump truck? And I mean, like, you're literally like putting yourself in danger. And she's like, well, maybe I like the danger. Maybe I like coming within a hair of death to experience what life is like, or something to that effect. And so she has this really meaningful exchange with him in that she says, like, sometimes I see darkness, I see death, but sometimes I also see hope. Those three things are not necessarily commensurate with each other, right? Like, I mean, darkness and death are certainly kind of very similar to each other. It's the final oblivion. But hope, like, what does that mean? Does she hope to die? Does she hope to transcend? Does she hope for something better? And all of this kind of comes full circle when you get to the ending of the movie, where that idea of death, or physical death, finally takes Kusanagi. But instead of dying on that surgical table, she ends up melding with, or I'm sorry, not on the surgical table, she's on the floor of this like weird building where she just gets completely shredded by Tachikomo. But she ends up melding with the puppet master and emerges a completely new entity, right? So this is that eschaton that we were referring to originally. It's the end of the world as we might be able to perceive it, because she is now a physical being and a trans-physical being, right? She is connected to all of the networks ever, but she's also remaining fundamentally human. So she is like this completely new entity. Okay, and then finally, I want to go ahead and wrap this up by talking about one of my favorite shows, Cowboy Bebop.
I saw everyone sit up just a little bit straighter when Cowboy Bebop
I know,
was mentioned.
right? Yeah. For the purposes of this panel, I am going to avoid talking about the Netflix Cowboy Bebop because we do not spread negativity here. However, if you'd like to know my feelings on Netflix Cowboy Bebop, please feel free to send me a private message and I will inundate you with a 30-page essay about how and why it's terrible.
He took notes while watching it.
I was watching this thing like, why is this garbage?
I have the notepad still. It's great.
Okay, so let's talk about this scene.
This is real mystic and all, but do you have anything to eat here? I see.
The red-eyed coyote will appear in the Zona Norte at the far end of town. That is what I see.
A red-eyed coyote north of town?
You, swimming bird.
Huh?
The swimming bird will meet a woman. The bird will be hunted by this woman. And then death.
One more time.
What's that?
I was killed once before. By a woman.
You take women too lightly, my friend.
On the contrary. Catch you later.
Wakantanka guide his spirit.
Okay. I unapologetically and sincerely, with all my heart, love this show because it is probably one of the most nuanced and interesting deconstructions of
ultra-capitalism and corporatism and the idea that all cops are bastards. But it does so without really ever passing judgment on which side of that spectrum you sit on, right? So let's take this idea of spirituality first, right? The very first scene in the show is Spike going to see a Native American shaman who's giving him profound wisdom, speaking in somewhat stereotypical, but nevertheless very weighty language, right? He's like giving him all of this symbolism. Here, the red bird, and woman is going to come and try to kill you. And then Spike is just like, whatever. Shit happens. I've already been dead once, like no big deal, right? So he kind of doesn't take it very seriously at all. He kind of shrugs it off. But this idea of nihilism in the face of annihilation is something that's very central to the entire ethos of Cowboy Bebop. The whole point, right? The whole conceit, the very core message, I would say, of Cowboy Bebop is like, you do what you got to do to survive. So this idea of being the underdog is central to Cowboy Bebop, but whereas Cyberpunk 2020 is high-tech, low-life, I would argue that Cowboy Bebop is like medium, janky, broken down tech, really terrible life unless you find some beef for your bell peppers, right? And you take the bad with the bad, but when the good comes, you don't question where it comes from. You just kind of take it and you go with it. Right, and which is why that phrase, whatever happens, happens, is so central to the ethos of Cowboy Bebop, and one of the reasons why I chose it as a title for this panel is because, it's kind of like what most Japanese cyberpunk is all about. It's just like kind of like, meh, shit happens, like whatever, we're just gonna let it roll off our backs. So the idea of corporatism, and particularly working within a corporate system, is something that's extremely central to Japanese culture. As I've already mentioned, a lot of Japan is extremely corporate, primarily because most people who work as salarymen in service of these corporations essentially dedicate their lives to these corporations. Like they are fully committed to this idea. It's like being in service of a daimyo.
It's like the thing in the States where like when someone asks what you do, your first reaction is your job. But if your job was like your only hobby or like really the only thing you really did.
Right. Yeah, and like the funny thing is that
it's like every business major you've ever met who's like way too into working for one particular company.
Yeah, this trope of like the Japanese guy who spends 14 hours a day at the office and whose only form of outlet is like putting his necktie around his head like a headband and like just pounding like sake at the local bar. That's actually not terribly far from the truth. That's not a stereotype. I mean, it is a stereotype, but it's not really a stereotype if it can be true, right? For a lot of people, that is their way of life. And so for some of them, I don't know if you guys remember this, but like especially in the late 90s when there were a lot of corporate layoffs in Japan, a lot of people ended up kind of committing suicide over this because like their entire life was the corporation. And so if you lose your job, you have no more reason to go on. And so this show, in kind of its infinite wisdom, doesn't really pass judgment on that. Like, yeah, they're pulling shitty gigs for really shady customers, but at the end of the day, it's like, fuck you, I have cats to feed, right? There's a dog who needs dog food. Our beef is like, our bell peppers need beef.
There's a strangely feral child we have to feed.
And so the interesting thing about this is that they do whatever they need to do to survive within a system that actively antagonizes and potentially doesn't even know they exist, right? So this is where I think, for me, the fascinating thing comes in about this show. We're going to come back to this slide later for a different reason, but what I would like to do now is I'd like to take a look at the end of this.
What? This again? God.
Start right now. So this is the point at which Spike ends up chasing Asimov.
Huh? Damn!
And so notice, shoot, I suck at this, I'm sorry. So what I want to do now is referencing high-tech, low life. Right, so we have this brilliant shot right here of
the city as they're passing over it, as they're flying over it in their ship, where you have, I promise I'm an adult. Okay, so this is kind of a blurry shot, but what you see in the high def version is that there's like this magnificent city that's kind of like stretching out over the plain, right? And so we have this ancient aqueduct here, and then we have these futuristic spaceships. And so it's this melding of nature and futurism and antiquity, and all these things are just kind of slapped together aesthetically. And like, nobody knows how it works, but like, it just fucking works, right? For some reason, these three things coexist very, very well. And so from here, we go to this really interesting exchange.
That's enough.
And then the blues kicks in, right? Road to the West.
Stop it, please! That stuff is going to kill you! No!
And then we have the cops trying to get to
never get out of here now.
the gate.
I'll never see Mars. Adios.
And then we have more blues.
Hey, Spike, get it while it's hot, buddy. Huh?
Right. There is so much brilliance in this, and it absolutely summarizes just about every major trope of Japanese cyberpunk. On the surface, this seems like a pretty standard ending for an episode, but if we dig a little bit deeper, I think it's fundamentally brilliant in how it communicates a lot of stuff. So I already mentioned that we start off with this weird blending of spiritualism and antiquity, but it's combined with modernity, and it's all kind of just slapped on top of each other. Then we have this rise towards the stars, right? And then the Asimov's ship gets shredded by cops, and then we have this incredibly tense, dramatic moment as Spike realizes, oh no, I just lost like $1 billion on this bounty because she shot him, and then she gets shredded by machine guns, and we have this absolutely beautiful death scene where she's like spilling out over the shards of glass, and the vials are spilling out from her stomach like blood. And then the next scene, we have a smash cut right to the middle of the kitchen, and Jet's like, hey, beef and bell peppers time, right? And there's like absolutely no breath. There is no room allowed for any kind of contemplation. So it's basically like, oh well, shit happens. We lost $1 billion. Waka waka. Let's just try again tomorrow, right? And so this, yeah.
Do with the hand up right there.
Please.
I just want to say that I love the fact that it's actually just them going full circle like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and it's the circuitous nature of the gig economy that is fundamentally linked to this. But like, if you think about it, like he was tasked with taking drugs from this guy, right? Apprehending him, turning him in, collecting a bounty on him. Bounty hunting is not exactly a very glamorous nor a very well looked upon position. And this is somehow still portrayed as like, these are our heroes. They're not anti-heroes. They don't have flexible morals. They're just the good guys, right? And if they fail, no big deal. They get to try again tomorrow. So it's this kind of non-judgmentalism that's fundamentally ingrained into this ethos.
I would like to point out my favorite episode with the trucker, who the trucker convoy saves the day. It's just a random woman with a very like Southern accent who is like clearly designed. She's bigger bodied. She's designed to be like everything that in animation would not be a desirable hero's qualities.
And she's also very clearly coded as not straight.
Yeah, she's uneducated. She's clearly coded queer. She's clearly like, she's not what you expect a protagonist to be, but she is the hero of the day. And she just drives a truck. It's a space truck, but it's a truck.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah, and so on the subject of music, by the way, you remember how I pointed out that they play Road to the West, which is very bluesy, and then they play, I think, the opening to Don't Bother Nan, which has like the harmonica and blues harp. So blues is an interesting choice for this episode. So full disclosure, I teach a class on the history of blues, and a lot of what blues represents is, of course, like Americana, right? We connect the blues to spiritualism and to a lot of Southern Gothic mysticism, but also we frequently forget that blues, as it is known to us, is just a small, very tiny sliver of what blues actually is. The reason we know blues as we know it is because some white entrepreneur in the South by the name of J.C. Spear ended up buying a lot of these records and selling them and making a lot of blues in the 1920s very popular, but only one very specific type of blues because he thought that was the authentic thing. So we have this corporate business-like interest in this folk art that has absolutely nothing to do with corporatization or monetization that was monetized and sold to us. And so what we have now is basically a perception of this art form that is entirely based and structured around this idea of pretense. Okay. And final scene. That's what you know it as, but it's like a fraction of a percent. Exactly. Yeah, because technically blues is anything that you can think of. Like, are you just playing a guitar and like singing a song about your dog? That's blues, like if you want it to be, right? But we kind of came to understand that this is something very specific. Okay.
Guy in the button-up shirt.
Please.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Does that mean that the blues, all the blues that existed and that recorded, is that just gone?
No, but the majority of it is. So the majority of it was not recorded. It exists purely as kind of a vernacular thing. You can still hear it. There's still a lot of artists out there, and I'm happy to give you the name of at least a couple who still do a lot of like very traditional blues. But in the public zeitgeist, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so on this question of ACAB, Jet's a cop, but he got out, right? And so fundamentally, there's this relationship between the police and Jet and the rest of our gang that is kind of antagonistic because at the same time, like they exist outside of the boundaries of the law. But at the same time, there is, again, this lack of judgment being passed because instead of going like, you know, all cops are bastards, the show basically goes like, well, I mean, yeah, they are. They have compromised morals unless they don't, right? So there is this kind of duality there where like you can get out and still retain the good aspects of this without necessarily providing your services in the name of a symbol like a badge. So let's go ahead and just take a look at the scene real quick.
I'll take care of this. You can go back.
You're not gonna let him get away, are you?
When I was a cop, this was my beat. I'm the black dog, and when I bite, I don't let go. I have no regrets about her, but I'll settle this score on my own turf.
Justice and duty, huh? All right.
Listen carefully. Cut your engines now.
Jet!
I'm gonna fast forward just a hair.
Please, Jet. There are other bounty heads to catch. You don't need this one.
If I let him go now, someone else will be after him tomorrow. And by then, you'll be an accomplice.
Stay away!
You still have time, Elisa.
Stop protecting me! That's just how you were back then. You decided everything. In the end, you were always right. When I was there with you, I never had to do anything for myself. All I had to do was to hang on to your arm like a child without a care in the world.
I'm going to pause right here because, you guys can probably finish the scene on your own, and I don't want to keep you here unnecessarily long. The fact that he bends his morals and lets them go, and effectively lets go of that bounty, once again kind of reinforcing this notion of like, whatever happens, happens. Again, reinforces this notion of duality, right? It's that you can have flexible morals, but at the same time be beholden to a moral code that separates this idea of right versus wrong from doing the correct thing versus doing the right thing, right? So it's kind of difficult to explain it. Again, like I am right at the end of my time, so I want to stop right here. But if you want to know more about this, like certainly feel free to let me know in like a private message or something. So let's take a look at this kind of the summary for this. So the big thing in the difference between American and Japanese cyberpunk is what is emphasized and what is de-emphasized. And for me, the main thing is that the ingrained corporate structures and transcendental spirituality are often at odds in American cyberpunk. In Japanese media, this isn't necessarily the case. They are often seen as two halves of the same thing, and like they can't really coexist in some sort of tentative unity. Japanese cyberpunk also plays very fast and loose with the idea of authority and privilege. Primarily because Japan has always been more or less a xenophobic country. It hasn't really had a lot of outside influence until the middle of the 20th century. A lot of this notion of privilege is kind of lost in them, and a lot of it is very stratified based on class. I think you actually had something to say about that. And then finally, there's this notion of stratification, which again, the haves and the have-nots are not really kind of clearly defined. Most of the people who are functioning within the cyberpunk society in Japan are very much disempowered and very much robbed of their agency. So anyway, again, I thank you for bearing with us. I would like to offer you the option of contacting us on social media if you'd like to know more about it.
Yes. If you have any questions, like say 3 weeks from now, you're in the shower and you're like, I should have asked those weirdos that question.
Yeah,
please feel free to Instagram
free.
us. If you want to know any of the videos that we used, any of the philosophers we mentioned,
I will happily share those with you.
we will happily share our bibliography with you. Thank you for sticking this out. We really appreciate it,
We're going to
guys.
start packing up. Thank you so much for being here.
If you have questions,
just come right up. We'll talk to you. We'll love talking to people.